Should probably turn the camera on. Good evening, everybody. It is July 2nd, 2023. Welcome to another episode, a live episode of The Breakdown. I'm your host, Nate Pike. We're going to be running down the major events of the week in Alberta politics. And then we're going to be opening it up to our regular town hall. So if anybody has any thoughts they want to share, if we get something wrong and somebody wants to tell us how and why we got it wrong, that's going to be the opportunity to do so. That's what we're here for. But we got a lot to talk about this week. It's been a little bit since the election, about a month, and we're seeing no shortage of drama. But the good news is the relief. There was no Your Province, Your Premier this weekend. They're doing it every 2 weeks. So thank God for small mercies, I guess, because we didn't have to listen to an hour of that. But as we'll see a little bit later on in the show, there's no shortage of Smithisms that we need to get into. But we're going to start with some of the lighter stuff, the maybe not so. It's a really short list of lighter stuff this week. I'm not going to even try to lie about it. It's a pretty dark week, but we're going to see if we can't have some fun with it. So to start with, the NDP went ahead and announced their cabinet ministers. So one of the things, their shadow cabinet would be a much better way to say it. One of the things that happens when a new government's formed is the people that win, they get to form a government, and they get to decide who's going to be in charge of what. They make those people cabinet ministers. So one of the things that happens on the flip side of the coin is if there's an official opposition party, which there is in Alberta because we now live in a two-party state, then the official opposition then gets to go ahead and create a shadow cabinet, or people who are critics. They're responsible for saying to the ministers, "Oh, I don't like that," and we got to see the shadow cabinet for the NDP get announced this week. Now, it's worth noting probably that when we're talking about the NDP shadow cabinet, the UCP cabinet's been pretty big under Danielle Smith. So when she was first elected, when she first became premier, she created a cabinet that was the biggest cabinet in pretty much living memory. She had a boatload of ministers in charge of all of the different things. She knocked it down a couple, probably because she lost a bunch of seats in the last election. But the NDP, they're not leaving anyone at all behind. It looks like with this election, one of the things that we're looking at is there's going to be a boatload of NDP critics. Pretty much every single one of them, it appears, is going to be an NDP critic. It's a huge portfolio, and it's interesting to see some of the things they've done with it, because they've broken down some of the ministries proper into multiple little sub-ministries. There's multiple individuals who are responsible for critiquing the health section. There's multiple other ministries that have been broken down. But one of the things that's really important to highlight about this is largely a political endeavor. This is largely this is how we're going to divide things up. It doesn't mean anybody's getting paid more. You don't get paid more to be a critic or a shadow minister. It's just one of the responsibilities that you get for not having to be a minister or somebody who's in government. So there's that piece to start off. But we got a lot more to talk about, because as we saw starting off the week, the little town of Leduc, the city of Leduc, I guess technically. Little town sounds cuter, and it's nice to start with cute, because we're going to get right into the ugly right quick. They had this council meeting. One of the things that can happen at council meetings for most municipalities is anybody who has any concerns can step up to the microphone and share their concerns. We've certainly seen this in the city of Calgary. Anybody who's paid any attention to the goings on in Calgary City Hall probably knows the I don't know what the word would be, the antics, let's go with, of a certain individual whose name maybe, not saying it does, but maybe rhymes with hairy leather. I don't know, just what I hear. He's certainly had some hot mic moments in Calgary City Hall, but Leduc, they really kind of raised the bar. There are two folks who wanted to share some thoughts. Now, we want to set the stage with the first little bit because you could kind of see within the opening minutes of this individual's rant, delusion. I'm not sure what to call it. It was going to be going some fascinating places.
Talked about homeless and stuff like that. What's going on downtown Edmonton will come here if you're not careful. It's being done on purpose also. Another way to stop your trees from dying is to request the Fed stop spraying kerosene, raw gasoline, raw diesel, strontium, aluminum, barium, lithium, atrazine. You know what atrazine does? Turns females or males into females. Actually, literally. It's in lots of the herbicides and stuff like that they put on all the plants. Nobody's watching that stuff. Nobody. Easy job. Figure out what's going on with the trees and stuff, why they're dying. It's got nothing to do with climate change. Thank you. God created our bodies perfectly. We are exquisite beings. 15 to 17% oxygen when you're breathing through a mask. Without the mask, you get 20.9%. It's perfectly set. If you wear a mask, you're not getting the proper oxygen content. That means you're not running at full capacity. It's like having your air filter on your car plugged up. Just wanted to mention that for this gentleman over here.
Already we have a lot to unpack because he's coming in hot with the chemtrails. Oh, those chemtrails, they're bad news bears we stopped just a hair short of making the frogs gay in that rant, I feel like, but that bits and worse is coming up in a second. But it's fascinating to see the conspiracy theories that are getting spewed out right at the gates. The homelessness, the houselessness problem, it's being done on purpose. The chemtrails, they're killing the trees. It's not the burning or anything like that. It's a fascinating little rant. This individual has been identified in the media as being a Philip McDavid. And he, later on in his diatribe, the whole thing was on about 12 minutes. We're not going to subject you to that. But in his diatribe, he talks about how he worked with and continues to work with Danielle Smith to make the province a better place. And then his compatriot, the person who has been identified in the media as being his partner, one Laurel Scheffelmayer. I'm not trying to get that last name wrong on purpose. There's just a whole lot of combinations of letters there. She stepped up to the plate with a fascinating little interpretation of the Progress Pride flag.
The thing is, we've come so far into think that being inclusive of everyone is a God-given right. Now, I'm going to show you guys something here real quickly. The original Pride flag, okay, had red, orange, yellow, green, blue, and purple. What they added to it was this: a black, blue, I'm going to say this again, a black, brown, light blue, light pink, and white. I'm going to tell you the secret hidden agenda of this because there's lots.
Ask him what it means.
Do you guys know what that means? Yeah, good question. Someone please answer that, since you guys all promoted it.
We're not allowed to, in public commentary, to have a back and forth discussion. You can
Okay,
make
no
your
problem.
presentation.
Let me explain. Let me explain to everyone who doesn't know, including you guys. You may not know. Okay? The black stands for necrophilia. Do you guys know what that is? That's sex with the dead.
That's right, Ryan.
The brown stands for bestiality. Bestiality. Do you know what that is?
Your
That's
worship,
sex with animals.
I call for a point of privilege.
The blue stands for pedophilia with baby boys.
Okay, I've made
The
a privileged
pink
motion.
stands
The
for
speaker's supposed to stop
pedophilia
speaking.
with baby girls.
Call for
The
it.
white stands for
No, we're going too far. Excuse me. Okay, we'll take a recess right now. We'll take a.
Now, obviously, that's a hard thing to listen to for a lot of people, especially since that rant happened towards the tail end of Pride Month. The bottom line is, and it blows my mind that we have to say this. It really does, because that was about as an unhinged rant full of made up bullshit as one can possibly imagine. But just for the cheap seats, just to set the record straight, let's talk about what that clearly unwell woman is talking about. So we're talking about, with this particular conversation, we're talking about the Progress Pride flag. Now everybody's familiar with the Pride flag, which has the colors going horizontally. A fun little anecdote that we picked up in the research of this. It originally included the color pink as well, but when they first started making the flags, there was a shortage of pink fabric, so they had to make do, which I think is just a fun little fact about the Pride flag. But let's talk about what the colors mean. So we've got the red, and there's different interpretations within the same vein. So you might see different words that are associated with it, but red is life, orange is healing, yellow is new ideas, green is prosperity, blue is serenity, violet is spirit. And then when we get to the chevron, the sideways chevron, or the angly cutty things that are on the left side of the flag, black and brown refers to people of color, and it also refers to people who died during the AIDS pandemic. White, blue, and pink are representative of trans folks, and the yellow, with sometimes a purple circle, sometimes not, is representative of intersex folks. Absolutely none of that has anything to do with any of the things that Laurel listed off there. What she listed off is pure conspiracy theory bullshit. It's pure fantasy. And it is, quite frankly, harmful, because as Laurel and Philip so skillfully demonstrated, there are people who don't know better who buy into this stuff. There's been a lot of debate as to whether or not that video should be played. There's been a lot of debate as to whether or not people should be exposed to it. We've had that debate over here ourselves as well. And where we've landed is, yeah, it's hurtful to hear those things. There are people who are members of the LGBTQ2S plus community who hear that and go, oh, damn, I don't like that there's people who view me that way. And they've got absolutely every right to feel that way. But these people, the Laurels and the Phillips, they have enjoyed operating inside of their echo chambers and slowly expanding those echo chambers outward. We're seeing more and more hateful rhetoric that has been targeted towards the LGBTQ2S plus community, and it's not going to go away by not talking about it. The more people that talk about it, the more people that openly condemn it, maybe there will be a little bit of hesitation that happens before these people publicly espouse these hateful views. And the more that we talk about it, and we include the fact that, hey, you know what? That's not at all what the Pride flag or the Progress Pride flag stands for. Here's what it actually stands for. Maybe we do a little bit of education. All of those things are critically important in order to diffusing the bullshit bomb that's currently in the process of going off in the province of Alberta. Now, there is some good news that comes out of this, because some of the city councillors who are involved with Leduc, Councillor Ryan Pollard, he came out with a very strong statement where he not only explained what the proper colors are, explained why it's important that things like the pride flag get raised, things like pride crosswalks happen, but he took a hard stance in condemning it. It's good to see elected officials condemn this sort of rhetoric. It's good to see elected officials actively distancing themselves from this sort of rhetoric. Now, we haven't seen, and we're by no means journalists or we make that very clear. We haven't seen any evidence that Councillor Ryan Pollard has, I don't know, hung out with Laurel or Philip. We haven't seen any evidence that he has any sort of history or backstory with Laurel or Philip. One would think, though, if he believed that these views were as ugly, or any other elected official, if they had any kind of history and they believed that these views were ugly and repugnant, they would go out of their way to separate themselves from it. They would go out of their way to identify these views as being hateful and repugnant. And you have to know what's coming next, because one of the things that made the circulation shortly after all of this came out was a picture of Laurel and Philip posing with none other than Danielle Smith during her leadership race. We've looked. We couldn't find any condemnation from Danielle Smith about Laurel and Philip's views. We did find some lovely pictures of her on a train, though. Apparently, she had a great week riding the train. So, there's that. But it's important to realize that, there is overlap that exists. Danielle Smith appears to be in a picture with Laurel and Philip. Laurel allegedly has been involved with the group Take Back Alberta. And we know, not only from David Parker's appearance in Calgary recently, where he went on a great big rant about the anti-human agenda, but we also know that they held an event, were planning to hold an event on June 28th. In Bonnyville, where there was going to be speaking about leave our kids alone. And there's going to be discussion about what are we going to explore? Parental rights. What's next for Take Back Alberta? David Parker, who we're going to get into a little bit more. David Parker was going to be doing a speech where he was going to talk about the future of Take Back Alberta. Looks like the future of Take Back Alberta might be a little bit rocky. Their fundraising numbers came out during the election. Not great. In debt to the tune of almost $20,000. So that's a strong start. But there's also some other things that are going on with Take Back Alberta. But again, we have this anti-trans, anti-LGBTQ2S+ rhetoric that's being put on by Leighton Gray, who is affiliated with the Alberta Prosperity Project, which we know is the separatist, sovereignist group that Danielle Smith endorsed as her plan B in case Justin Trudeau doesn't do what she wants him to. This is who they are. And like I said, David Parker was in Calgary 2 weeks ago, where he went on a huge rant at a protest that was claiming to be organized by a group claiming to represent the Muslim faith and Islam. Fortunately, there's been a lot of members of the Muslim faith who have said, "Oh, that's not us. That's not our brand." It was a privilege to have one of those people raise their voice on the podcast last week. You should go back and listen to it because it's powerful stuff if you've missed it. But this is who they are. And they're very, very clear about what they want. And it's been a bumpy couple of weeks for Take Back Alberta because the master plan doesn't seem to be going exactly to, well, plan. We saw on June 21st, there was an email that Vince Byfield, who is, yes, the son of the private religious school founder and fire and brimstone columnist, started the Alberta Report, Ted Byfield, Vince was elected as part of the Take Back Alberta slate endorsed candidates, potato. And Vince had an idea he wanted to pitch to the board. Now, it's important to understand that there's some governance pieces that get a little nuancy here. One of the governance pieces that gets a little nuancy is with the UCP, the only time that votes are supposed to be done by email are if it's an emergency matter. Well, here's Vince. We got the copy of the email. Here's Vince saying, hey, you know what? Cynthia's great and everything, but she just sucks so much. Cynthia Moore, president of the UCP. And he put forward a motion that somebody named Patrick Malkin, who, yes, was another one of the endorsed Take Back Alberta candidates who ran for the UCP board. He suggested that he, with his over 25 years in experience in hospitality and event management, that Patrick Malkin be vested by the United Conservative Party Board of Directors with the authority to manage and oversee all future UCP, AGM, and policy events effective today, including being in charge of preparing budgets and pricing for the AGM for finance and board approval. Now, so what he's saying there is he wants Patrick Malkin to be able to run all of the UCP's events in the future, and the board has to approve the dollars and cents of it. But beyond Patrick being somebody who was one of the TVA endorsed candidates, Patrick has been in the news before. You might remember Patrick from the pandemic days, where a restaurant that has been widely reported that he owned was, instead of accepting the vaccine documentation, because there was the period where we had the vaccine passport program that was going on. If you wanted to go to a restaurant, you had to show your documentation. Instead of accepting passports or the documentation that people were vaccinated, Patrick's restaurant reportedly got in trouble with Alberta Health Services because they were accepting pictures of dogs, not the vaccine passport. So, you know, Patrick's got a really strong history of being given rules to follow and then following them. And that's who Mr. Byfield wanted to put in charge of all of the organization for all UCP events going forward in the future. Now, this kicked up a boatload of drama. There was a column that came out written by Don Braid on the 29th that was talking about the controversy that was going on. Take Back Alberta could plunge UCP into another disastrous blow up. And it looks like the blow up may have happened more on the Take Back Alberta side than the UCP side. But that column was based on a series of tweets that David Parker put out, where he went after UCP Provincial Board President Cynthia Moore. To give you just a little bit of it, UCP Provincial Board President Cynthia Moore has become a tyrant, as reported in the media, from leaks she or one of her minions provided. She is attempting to run the democratically elected board of the party by degree. This makes her leadership illegitimate and anti-democratic. She must be removed. And then goes on to list a bunch of complaints. But here's this thing that we just want to take a pause. We want to take a second to really savor, to appreciate, to enjoy the flavor of. Let's do that paragraph again. Now, it's worth noting, this is David Parker, the leader of Take Back Alberta. This is his Twitter account. And you can see it's got the blue check mark. Now, not dissing too hard on the blue. I know the blue check mark gets a lot of shade. There's a lot of people like, those blue check mark people, they're sellouts. We just like being able to post videos that are long. There's beneficial features for us for paying a little bit of money every month to be able to get the Twitter blue. It's just a nice thing. One of those features that you get with the Twitter Blue, though, is the ability to edit your tweets up to an hour after you tweet the thing out. You can go back in and say, that's not the word I want to use. My auto incorrect went ahead and took care of things for me there, so I need to go ahead and fix that. And you can see Mr. Parker, he's got the blue check mark. So he could have, at any point within an hour of firing this little missive out, gone ahead and edited it. But nonetheless, she is attempting to run the democratically elected board of the party by degree. Now, of the comments that exist on this tweet, the vast majority of them point out to Mr. Parker, it's actually decree with a C, not a G. Now, if this was any other person's Twitter account, then yeah, it would be a little bit of an easy shot to be like, oh, you spelled that word wrong. And Lord knows there's no shortage of tweets from the breakdown over the years where we've not hit the grammatically correct full force or used wrong words. But we do pay for the Twitter Blue in order to be able to edit that now. And it's an absolute mystery as to why Mr. Parker chose, despite the multiple notifications that he had to have gotten, that words are hard sometimes. He could have fixed it. He didn't. He left it up because Mr. Parker doesn't admit his mistakes. Well, he followed that tweet up with another one after the Don Braid article, where he listed off a series of reasons why UCP Provincial Board President Cynthia Moore must go. He didn't hold back. He used a lot of strong words. Fundamental to democracy. It's a subversion of the grassroots of the UCP and other words. Now that prompted, and this is where it gets really fascinating, that prompted the decision, apparently, for the chief financial officer of Take Back Alberta to sit down for an interview with Don Braid and talk about how he could no longer work with David Parker and was resigning his role as CFO or chief financial officer for Take Back Alberta. If you've been paying attention to the show for the last year or so, you probably know who that CFO is. And it makes me almost a little bit sad that I'm not going to be able to say his name nearly as much anymore because it's just so much fun. But the CFO of Take Back Alberta, who told Don Braid that he resigned the position because David Parker is too extreme for him, is none other than one of the people who's up for charges in regards to the Coutts blockade, Marco van Hugenbos. So let's just be super clear. One of the people who allegedly organized, I have to say allegedly because his court dates aren't done yet, allegedly organized the Coutts blockade, who was one of the key organizers, one of the key figures in the Coutts blockade, the illegal border blockade that many people have likened to sedition and some people have said should be considered treason. That was a complete disregard for processes and rule of law, which is particularly ironic given the fact that Marco van Hugenbos was at the time and still remains a city councillor in southern Alberta. Town councillor. Ignoring all of that, Marco van Hugenbos has decided to publicly state, with all of that in mind, that David Parker is too extreme for him. So that should give you a little bit of an idea of just how extreme David Parker is. Because when you're alienating people who are aware that there's governance processes, that there's rule of law processes, and those people choose to disregard them and hold illegal blockades at borders that they're now up on charges for, if that's the people that you're too extreme for, yikes on bikes. But it's important to realize none of this appears to have slowed down David Parker, because he had an event just a couple of days ago in Bonnyville. It appears to be the same event where they were talking about the parents' rights, or whatever you want to call it. He's committed to once-a-month meetings in each region of the province to continue the momentum of Take Back Alberta. The short-term goal is to finish replacing the UCP board this November at the AGM. The long-term plan is to spend the next 2 years building community to ensure we can take over our school boards in 2025. In the meantime, continuing to get all types on boards, libraries, allocation boards, all of that sort of thing. So David Parker is making it very clear that despite the fact that they didn't do financially too well, despite the fact that he appears to be too extreme for Marco van Hugenbos, he's not slowing down. He's coming for the school boards. He's coming for the library boards. He's coming for the allocation boards. He's coming for the UCP board. And it's worth remembering that as easy as it is to make jokes about the fact that he is too extreme for one of the alleged Coots blockade organizers, and that their financial picture doesn't appear to be super great. Ignoring all of that, the reality is David Parker and Take Back Alberta were at the last UCP AGM able to capture all of the seats that were up for election. There's no reason to believe that he will not be able to do the same thing again. And it's also worth pointing out, he doesn't even need the whole board. He only needs a couple of seats. So unless the non-Take Back Alberta segment of the UCP, if such a thing even exists, unless that group organizes and rallies their support with the same passion and conviction that Mr. Parker, who seems to have no other hobbies with which to spend his time, unless those factions meet Mr. Parker's intensity, he's going to get control. And the Vince Byfields will be able to put forward these motions, and they will be able to take control of all of the UCP events going forward. And it's worth noting, in Vince's email, the only thing that he wanted to have board approval for was the finances. All of the other aspects of the organization, those were supposed to be controlled by Mr. Malkin. That includes policy. That includes policy conventions. That includes when and how votes happen. They made it clear what their intent is. And the problem is the rhetoric and the language that they use and the fact that they don't quit is contributing to some really horrible things happening across the country. We saw in Waterloo this week a tragedy unfold where 3 people were injured after somebody who was very clearly motivated. It has been reported on widely that his motivations for going into that particular class and pulling out 2 knives and then proceeding to stab as many people as he could before he was stopped was purely because that class was a gender studies class. This is why condemning the rhetoric that people like David Parker and his ilk are using, the rhetoric that Laurel Scheffelmeyer and Philip McDavid are using, is so important, because there are people who are being emboldened, and there are people who are believing the batshit crazy notion that the black color, the brown color on the Progress Pride flag means necrophilia. There are people who believe that. And if we don't, as a society, collectively rise up to not only condemn that, but correct it, these people are only going to continue to get more and more momentum. One little news story today that popped up that we want to quickly touch on because it is somewhat relevant is we see folks like David Parker, folks like Laura Scheffelmeyer, folks like Philip McDavid talking about, it's the drag performers, they're the ones who are into exploiting children. They're the ones who are grooming. Well, we saw a tragic news story come out of largely Calgary, where 7 Calgary men have been charged in a child porn sting. We have identified more than 700,000 child sexual abuse images and videos, young innocent children, some as young as 6 months of age, says a law enforcement official. None of the people charged ever participated in a drag performance. We get this notion that if anybody has any sort of non-binary, cis, straight orientation, that somehow, just because that steps a little bit out of our understanding, that must mean they're deviant. That must mean that they're some sort of predator because it makes us uncomfortable. And it's absolute garbage, because you take a look at the history, and disproportionately, the people who are doing all of the things that the David Parkers and the Laurel Scheffelmeyers and the Philip McDavids accuse the LGBTQ2S plus community of, they're not members of that community. Sure as hell aren't doing drag shows in libraries, because as we learned in our conversation with Shane on You, all of the performers involved in those have to get stringent security checks. They have to get vulnerable sector checks. Moving on from there, the Deena Hinshaw scandal continues. Some of you might remember back at the beginning of June, there was a memo that circulated that appeared to show that Deena Hinshaw had been hired to work with the Indigenous Wellness Corps. And we were one of the groups that said, "Oh, this looks interesting. What's this all about?" HS issued their statement saying Deena Hinshaw does not work for Alberta Health Services, and we don't comment on who works for Alberta Health Services. So don't be confused by the contradictory nature of that tweet at all. We saw last week, after some incredible work by investigative journalists, and most importantly, the bravery of one of the physicians who was involved in the hiring of Dr. Deena Hinshaw, Dr. Tailfeathers, stepped down in her role, and we'll talk about why in just a couple seconds here. But we saw that, in fact, Dr. Hinshaw had been hired to work with the Indigenous Wellness Corps, that had been approved all the way up through the AHS leadership chain. We also saw Danielle Smith openly admit, yeah, I was briefed on that, and then apparently John Cowell made some decisions. We've got some FOIPs pending that we are sure we'll get back heavily redacted versions of the things and the stuff. But we saw some very strong statements released this week after that, the news that, yeah, that memo was real came out. We saw from the Indigenous Physicians Association of Canada, we echo the truth that she has shared, that this action by a non-Indigenous organization to nullify the hiring decision that she and her colleagues have made echoes the role of Indian agents asserting power over our affairs. It amounts to the same colonial pattern of imposed and unwanted control over our rightful autonomy and decision-making when it comes to the issues affecting Indigenous peoples. Now, if you're not familiar with what Indian agents were, they were basically the warlords that governed First Nations and Indigenous groups and peoples under the authority, air quotes, of the Indian Act for a disproportionate amount of time. That included who could leave the reservations, when they could leave the reservations. That included who got what kind of food, what kind of access to food, and when. And there's no shortage of stories that exist in Canadian history of how horrible a lot of those Indian agents conducted themselves and how they abused their power. So the fact that the Indigenous Physicians Association of Canada is invoking that isn't by accident. And the fact that Danielle Smith, some people are saying, may have had a direct hand in making this decision isn't lost on anyone, because Danielle Smith is also the Premier of Alberta who made the claims that appear by all reasonable assessment to be false, that she had Cherokee ancestry, so she gets it. That only adds, I imagine, insult to injury. But they weren't the only group that stepped up. We also saw a number of physicians from across the province issue a statement as well. They released an open letter where they said Dr. Hinshaw has been prevented from working for AHS. This is entirely unfair and unprofessional. Further, it signals to all physicians in this province that their positions are unsafe and could be targeted for political gain. There's no place for leadership which undermines the decisions, recommendations, and sovereignty of the Indigenous Wellness Corps, and no place for political interference in health care delivery. Now, this is a really important argument because it's important to realize when that memo was released, for all intents and purposes, the deal was done. Dr. Hinshaw had gone through, and there's people who have beef with Dr. Hinshaw. I got no shortage of things that I have in the past criticized her for as well. There's a lot of questions to be done about how effectively she executed her role as Chief Medical Officer of Health during the pandemic. But that aside, she went through the hiring process of the Indigenous Wellness Corps. the folks in charge of the Indigenous Wellness Corps said, this is the person that we want because she has a tremendous amount of background specific to Indigenous public health. They made that decision. They ran it up the flagpole. It got all of the levels of approval. And then for reasons, and those reasons haven't been made public, as much as Danielle Smith keeps saying, talk to Dr. John. The reality is he's not doing a whole lot of press conferences. Most of the media reports and the journalists that have tried to pursue answers from Dr. John Cowell have received the response, no comment. So the reality is that there was a hiring process that took place. Somebody was hired, and then for what conceivably can only be described as political reasons, that hiring process was terminated. So the question that forces, and this is the question that this group of Alberta physicians are highlighting, is that's a bit chilling, isn't it? If somebody can be removed, not because of their qualifications, not because of their ability to do the job, not because of their performance history, not because of the support of their supervisors or the direct leadership, not because of any of those things. Somebody can be removed just because somebody wants them removed. Why would anybody want to work in that environment? That's the fundamental question that these physicians are asking. And it's worth noting that this comes at a time, we just saw today, there were 16 new emergency room closures because of, drumroll please, lack of physicians. And yet here we have this message being sent down the tailpipe of what's going on. And what does Danielle Smith have to say when she's asked about it?
Smith, I want to follow up on a question you were asked probably like a dozen ago now. You know, you say you put John Cowell in place to field questions like why Dr. Deena Hinshaw was given a job, accepted the job, and then unhired the following day or the following day after it became public. But Cowell's not commenting. Alberta Health Services isn't commenting. I know you won't comment on that personnel change, so I won't ask you to. Instead, I'll say that over 100 doctors signed a letter alleging political interference and they want an investigation. So yes or no, was there any political interference? And how do you ensure Albertans that there wasn't any, as you've made it clear numerous times before you were elected that you're not a fan of Deena Hinshaw?
Look, we have a lot of change that we need to make in Alberta Health Services. Is the reason why I dismissed the board and put in an official administrator is so that we could accelerate many of the decisions that need to be made. And there's going to be a lot more decisions that have to come. And there's going to be a lot of personnel changes that have to come. And that's why I've delegated that to Dr. John Cowell to make those personnel changes. And we are going to make sure that we've got a system that focuses on the front line and focuses on having the right people in the right position doing the right thing. Our mental health and addiction strategy is led by mental health and addiction, Dan Williams, and I would encourage you to talk to him about what the strategy is going to be there. But I think people should expect that there's going to be a lot of change in our health system over the coming weeks and months as we make sure that we address the issues that have been chronic problems for literally decades. And that's what we're going to be focused on. And Dr. John Cowell's had his contract extended 6 months, and he's going to be leading that effort and making those personnel decisions. So those are the kind of questions you'd have to put to him.
Now, just to highlight a couple of wild, at least one wild coincidence before we talk about Smith's not answer. It's worth noting Dr. John Cowell's 6-month contract was announced after Dr. Deena Hinshaw's job was terminated, withdrawn, whatever the appropriate term is. That's just a crazy coincidence, isn't it? But when it comes to Smith's answer, we saw yet again, just like on Your Province, Your Premier last week, she's asked a direct question, yes or no, was there political interference? And she responds with all of the words except for yes or no. One would think if Smith knew that there was absolutely no record of her trying to politically interfere or anybody from her office trying to politically interfere in whether or not Dr. Deena Hinshaw kept this job, she would just say, that's ridiculous. Absolutely not. But instead, what she said, yet again, is she reiterated that the reason why she fired the AHS board and the reason why she hired Dr. John Cowell as the chief administrator was so that she could directly reach into AHS and make the changes that she wanted to make. She campaigned on that. She said it multiple times since she became the UCP leader. She wants to unarm's length the arm's length organization so that she can have direct control over what's going on. And she, in as much, reiterated that by talking about the fact that there were changes that still needed to be made. There's going to be more changes coming. But that was just the beginning of the Danielle Smith's very bad week in media, because she also appeared on it was like 15 minutes long, but it's so worth watching the whole thing. We're gonna play a couple of segments out of it because they're very worth highlighting. But one of the things that she did was she appeared on CTV in an interview conversation with Vashi Kapelos. This conversation was in no small part precipitated by the fact that Alberta finally released its overdose data. And it's really not good. As much as Danielle Smith loves to tout the fact that, oh, you know what, we've got this Alberta approach and it's world renowned. And yet since the beginning of 2023, whether you choose to count by the number of deaths or you choose to count by per capita, overdose deaths, drug poisoning deaths have only gone up. And in fact, it was a record-setting month in the province of Alberta. Deaths reached the highest that they have since they started being tracked. Not only that, but this trend with the deaths continuing to skyrocket up actually bucks the trend from previous years. Typically in previous years, you'd see a little bit of a peak over the winter, and then things would start to drop down before they started to ramp back up again heading into the next winter. Well, we're not seeing that at all. There was a little bit of a drop off in January after December, but it's been straight up ever since then. So Danielle Smith, she appears on the Vashi Kapelos Power and Politics, I think, or Power Panel, Power was powerful, whatever it was. It'll be on the bottom of the video we play in just a second here. And we wanted to pull out a couple of little sections because there's, unsurprisingly, some things that Danielle Smith says that are demonstrably false.
Don't see that success. And I take your point on wanting to get the model fully in place before evaluating that. But if you continue to see the kinds of months on record like the one in April, have you ruled out completely refocusing additional resources on safe supply out of principle?
We're not doing safe supply in Alberta. We're going to continue.
Even if it stops people from dying? Respectfully, Premier, even if it stops people from dying?
Look, there's no evidence it's working in British Columbia, I'm afraid to tell you. In fact, what we're seeing is that we're seeing a larger amount of these deadly drugs on the street, and we've got to take a different approach. Our approach is recovery.
But there is evidence that it works. I don't think it's fair to say there's no evidence that it works. With great respect again, Premier, there is a lot of evidence. I found 4 studies just today in preparing for this interview that did show that it was working. Are you ignoring that evidence because, out of principle, you don't agree with it?
Well, maybe you should look at what's happened in British Columbia over these last few months as well. They've seen the exact same acceleration in the number of deaths. And it's very sad. I know that they're just as distressed about it as we are. They have a bit of a different approach, and we have a different approach.
Now, let's be clear. That's not true. It's just not true. Danielle Smith is she's taking the hard line. Absolutely not. No safe supply. Because safe supply is super, super bad, y'all. Here's the problem. When you take a look at what the data actually is for BC, the reality is that BC is seeing a drop. Now, there's been a lot of controversy in BC because one of the things that BC decided to do was they decriminalized basically all personal amounts of what people would consider to be hard drugs. They decriminalized it. They said, you know what? If you want to have some drugs on you, we don't believe that you should have to go to prison for that. We're gonna try to destigmatize this. We're gonna try to make it a little bit easier for people to access the drugs that they use anyways, and maybe we can make it a little bit less toxic, maybe a little bit less poisonous. Maybe we can give that a try. And it's worked in BC because the latest data, to quote from this story right here, the latest data from the BC Coroner Service shows 176. Now, that's still tragic. I want to be clear about that. 176 people dying from a toxic supply is not okay. 176 people died of toxic drug overdoses in May, representing a 16% annual decrease and a 19% monthly decrease. According to the report, which was released Monday, there were approximately 5.7 drug-related deaths each day of May 2023. But there were some other things that Danielle Smith said that we got to get into as well. And this one is probably not only the most egregious, but the one that shows the most highest level of ignorance.
No such thing as a safe supply of fentanyl. We believe that the solution is to get people off opioids and get their lives back.
What evidence do you have that there's no such thing as safe supply? I understand the statement that there's no such thing as safe supply of fentanyl, but the problem is that these drugs are laced with fentanyl and therefore they are killing people at a higher rate. Why not throw everything you have at it and combine your recovery-oriented approach with more of a focus on safe supply?
That's not our approach in Alberta.
Now, it's this part kind of hurts. Because not only do I have to take Premier Smith out for a walk, apparently I have to take Vashi out for a walk as well, because literally everything they both said in that clip is wrong. There's no such thing as a safe supply of fentanyl. It doesn't exist. Fentanyl is a drug. It's not manufactured under any sort of strict circumstances. It's definitely not a product that you see regular. Oh, it is. It's manufactured in safe supplies. There's vials and bottles of it that are used in medicine all the time. Fentanyl, as a quick refresher course, is a synthetic opioid, which means it's an artificially made drug that's similar to drugs like morphine or heroin that come from the poppy plant. But it's made artificially. This is one of the reasons why drug dealers love fentanyl, because it's cheap and easy to make if you know how to do it and you have the right things. One of the other things that drug dealers really like to do, though, is get as much mileage out of their supply as they possibly can. This is one of the reasons why we've seen issues with a toxic supply. Fentanyl as a drug, in and of itself, the most dangerous thing about fentanyl is it stops you breathing. It takes away your respiratory drive. If you're given a drug like Narcan, or if you have somebody breathe for you or ventilate you, it's not lethal. That's why it's used in medical procedures. Not only is it a very effective painkiller, but it's also used routinely in surgeries. It's also used routinely as a prescription medication to manage pain. The problem that exists with the supply, and one of the reasons why the Narcan or the naloxone kits haven't been as effective, is because that supply is being cut with all kinds of crap. This is the fundamental problem with a street drug situation. You have drug dealers who are cutting it with, and we've seen recent reports of sedatives like xylazine, which Narcan doesn't work on. We've seen reports in the media of it being cut with diabetic medications, which means you can give them all the Narcan in the world, but if their blood sugar has been pushed down to next to nothing because they were accidentally taking diabetic medications because it's a toxic supply, there's nothing that all the Narcan in the world isn't going to do anything about that. Fentanyl, in its pure form, as it's administered in medical situations, absolutely is available as a safe supply. And the kicker, the absolute kicker to this, is if Danielle Smith bothered to, I don't know, review the government of Alberta's own website, she could find a list of different formulations of fentanyl that are available and the costs. This is one of the fundamental arguments that we see advanced by people like organizations like Each and Every. When you take a look at the cost of providing people with a safe supply, And you juxtapose that against the cost of having them have to be resuscitated by emergency services and be admitted to ICUs because they've been exposed to erratic amounts of the drug that they're going after, which is an opiate. And they've been exposed to God only knows what else has been cut into it to make the amount that the drug dealer can sell bigger. How much does fentanyl cost? Well, if we go to the Alberta website, we can see that you can get 100 micrograms of fentanyl in an ampule, which is a boatload of fentanyl, by the way, for $1.91. If you're worried about somebody taking all of that fentanyl at one time, 100 micrograms of fentanyl is a lot of fentanyl. But if you're worried about someone taking all of that fentanyl all at one time, there's patches that allow the fentanyl to enter a person's system over time. How much do those cost? $2.23. It's been pointed out by people like you and Thompson of Each and Every that when you compare the cost of all of the emergency response, the cost of all of the property crime that happens because people need to get money to pay for their drugs, and you juxtapose that against the $1.91 that it costs per vial of fentanyl, not only could we be very easily making sure that these people are getting the drugs that they're after, the drugs that they, quite frankly, in many cases need. Because if you haven't seen or you don't know what being dope sick looks like, maybe watch the movie Trainspotting is all I'm saying. Because it's brutal and it can be deadly. So for people who are trying to prevent themselves from getting dope sick, they're going to use any kind of opiate that they can get their hand on. We could make sure that those opiates are safe. We could be saving ourselves money. But for ideological reasons, and ideological reasons alone, Danielle Smith is saying, no, we're not going to do that. And you want to know what she appears to be basing her decisions on? Because we've already established that what Danielle Smith believes about the situation in British Columbia is false. She does not have accurate information in regards to what's going on in BC. And she's demonstrated time and time again, she doesn't understand the history of what's going on in BC. So where does Danielle Smith get her information from? She tells us.
At one study, for example, that looked at a safe supply program out of a center in Toronto, 50% of those people that were coming into the program reported having had an overdose in the 3 months before starting Safer Supply. Among clients who were in that program for at least 6 months, 15% reported having had an overdose in the past 3 months. That's a pretty dramatic reduction. If you have the evidence before you that Safe Supply can aid in the ultimate goal you have, which is completely understandable, helping people rehabilitate and get off drugs completely, why not, like I said, throw all you have at it?
Well, we're watching what's happening in British Columbia and what we're observing. You've probably seen the documentary Canada's Dying. I was quoted in it, as was my chief of staff who's leading our effort here.
The Aaron Gunn documentary, Canada is Dying. Now, I actually sat down and watched that cinematographic endeavor. It is, I mean, I'm not going to use my own words. I'll use some of the other words that I've read on the interwebs here. It is, some people say, a propaganda piece. It is, some people say, hyperbolic and sensationalistic and entirely ignoring available evidence. We did a whole section on it a couple episodes ago. It's not reliable. It's not unbiased. It's not something that the Premier of Alberta should be citing as evidence for her decisions, as reason for her decisions, because you know what? They gave her a shout out. And her chief of staff appeared in it. If our drug policy in the province of Alberta, it's bad enough the notion that our drug policy in the province of Alberta is being driven by ideological means. But if it's being driven by vanity, we are in way more trouble than we realize. And the reality is that willful ignorance of the available facts, that willful ignorance of evidence, of scientific studies that have demonstrated that things like safe supply keep people alive so they have a better chance of entering recovery programs. To just ignore all of that because Marshall was in this internet documentary and they quoted me. Not only is that one of the laziest forms of governance, but it's straight up murderous. To not be willing to look at other solutions is bad. To not be willing to look at other solutions and then to promote infotainment at best is extremely dangerous. And to be clear, I would not want, the breakdown has been going for over 4 years now. We just had a birthday a couple months ago. Hooray us. We didn't do like a cupcake or anything. We'll try to catch it next year, but there was this election going on and things got a little nuts. If anyone was to say, you know what, I'm going to base a policy decision on something that we saw on the breakdown, I would say, oh, pump your brakes. And I would say that without hesitation. But one of the things that we're proud of here at the Breakdown is we try to source our information out from reliable sources that have done the research. So if anybody wants to take a look at any of the guests that we've had on the show, some of whom are absolutely experts in their field and base policy on that, fill your boots. But just because we said your name on the show doesn't mean that you should make policy about us. To put the finest point possible on this, BC has their own version of the drug database that we showed at the beginning of this segment. It's a little bit less graphical, a little bit more textual, but we're going to throw that up right now because there's a couple of points that are really important. It talks about the number of deaths. It talks about the ages. It's worth noting that the opiate crisis, at least in BC, disproportionately affects men, with 77% of those deaths in 2023 thus far being men between the ages of 30 to 59. But it's the last point on this slide, and for the Twitter Spaces folks, don't worry, I'm going to read it to you. It's the last point that... I'm going to say the last 2 points that are particularly important because one of the other pieces is the supervised consumption sites. There has been one death that occurred at an overdose prevention site. Previous reporting indicated that 2 such deaths had occurred at an OPS. After further investigation, 1 death has now been included. Please see the notes page for the definition of death at OPS, and that's worth taking a look at. But this is the really important one. There is no indication that prescribed safe supply is contributing to unregulated drug deaths. No indication. There's no indication that using safe supply has contributed to unregulated drug deaths. We have seen Danielle Smith step up and spin these stories about how, well, you know, it's the prescribed stuff, the good stuff is what people are selling in order to get at the fentanyl. There's no indication of that. There's no indication that giving people access to non-diluted, toxic, reliable, dose-measured amounts of drugs is contributing to unregulated drug deaths. One would think that if Danielle Smith is watching BC closely, she might have picked up that one little detail. But as you saw in those video clips, apparently not. All of that being said, that's the end of our planned content. So now we're going to open up the floor to our Twitter Spaces, folks. If you are watching this show either on YouTube or on the Facebook or after, I mean, if you're watching after the fact, you missed the boat. But if you're watching it live, then you can hop onto Twitter on a mobile device. It doesn't work on computers. It doesn't work on iPads, but you can hop on Twitter on a mobile device. And if Twitter's working at the moment, which this weekend it kind of has been a little bit on the unreliable side because apparently paying your server bills has consequences. Not paying your server bills has consequences. Hop on the Twitter Spaces. Would love to hear from you. We've already got somebody in the queue, so we are going to welcome a regular to the show. This is Cassandra. Cassandra, what's going on tonight? What do you got to say about the things and the stuff?
Well, every time I say I'm not going to say anything, you do something, and I'm like, oh God, I can't. I just, and this particular the subject that you ended with is something that is intimately close to my heart, and I'm going to tell you some things about just to give myself some credence here. Before I moved back to Alberta 21 years ago, I was working with an organization on the downtown east side of Vancouver called Pace Society. They changed what the P is now, but at the time it was Prostitution Alternatives Counseling and Education. We also had branched out and opened up a satellite office called the Pace Health Network right in Pigeon Square, the heart of the downtown east side. And our director at the time was Leonard Clare Cunningham. Late 90s, he wrote an article for the Vancouver Sun called Sins of the City, and it was about the fact that the spread of HIV and AIDS on the downtown east side rivaled that of the worst situations in some third world countries at the time. We also worked with an organization that was just a grassroots organization getting off the ground called VANDU, which is the acronym for Vancouver Area Network of Drug Users, which was a peer-based organization. And we also, I could go on about some of the people that I've worked with on the downtown east side of Vancouver. And, going back to Sins of the City, my friend's article, at the time it was true. Like, we were having Hep C and HIV were spreading like mad, and we were advocating, and part of that advocacy was working with VANDU. We were advocating to get safe injection sites going, and it was a hard fight. We got Insight up and going. I was around when that first happened. One of the first nurses to work there was somebody that we are, like, within our organization we worked with, and when I hear about that bloody, it's not even I don't know what you call it. They want to call it a documentary. That is not a documentary.
No, it's not.
It is not. It is a farce. It is so far. Like, the people that did that obviously have never, ever been to the downtown east side at all.
I don't disagree. And I've been there.
Like, they've never worked there. They know nothing, because when we put that safe injection, when we got that safe injection site approved after a lot of activism and advocacy, it saved lives. Like, it dramatically reduced the amount of deaths, and the amount of contraction of those of HIV and AIDS. I mean, we were already handing out needles and stuff, clean needles and stuff, but having them have a place where they could go in and have a nurse supervise and make sure that, when they were injecting, not only were the needles clean and they were using sterilized water, but that there was somebody there if something went wrong to immediately step in, because often what happens without those safe injection sites is people just, they OD on the street and there's no place to go. By the time they get to the hospital, they may not even be able to bring them back, and that's how they die. But the other thing that happens at those sites is that they're offered services. When you've got them sitting there in front of you, you can offer them services. You can work with those people. They can get to know them. Pace Health Network, one of the things, this is prior to 2000 when we were started, and it not just the organization, but multiple organizations were advocating for some source, some kind of safe supply, low dose. And one of the reasons, and I'll give you an example, if we had in the Pace Health Network was specifically dealing with sex workers that were also addicts. And you get a heroin addict in there and they're jonesing and they're dope sick. And you're trying to work with them. Well, they're bouncing all over, they're climbing the walls, they can't focus. It's just impossible. But if they just get just a little bit, like just a little amount, just to take the sickness away, you wouldn't even know. Like, you can work with them, you can get them housing, you can even get them employed. And we know from Portugal when they did this and started treating it as a health thing, that it was, once you do that, what happens is people are actually more likely to eventually be able to enter a rehab and treatment and stuff, and will seek it out. But it's just really hard, because what ends up happening without all of this is that, and this is the cycle that goes on in every city in Canada. You're answering the phones at your prospective agency. Somebody says, I'm ready to get clean. And you call and you try to get them, see if there's a bed available at the detox. And the detox says to you, I'm sorry, we don't have any beds available. Have them call back first thing in the morning. They might make it the next morning and actually be able to make that phone call. And then they get told that again. And each time they're told that, they're slipping farther back into the cycle that they're in. And it could be months before they come up for air and have the presence of mind where they can seek out that treatment again. Whereas the low dose, it keeps them just even, they can function, they can maintain a life of some sort and start improving their lives while they're waiting for that optimal moment where they can get into treatment. And that's the big difference. And it makes me so angry when I hear Pierre Poilievre and that stupid video and Danielle Smith, and because I personally witnessed the difference and how these things work. And I just know, and the fact that there are people that are believing what these people are saying because they must know what they're talking about, but they don't. And so I'm just endlessly passionate about this, and I can I could go on all night about different stories around this and things that I've seen, things that kept me going when I was working as a volunteer on the front lines with many times addicts, and the success stories, not just there's lots of tragedy, but there's success stories in those tragedies. And the more that we can do, including safe supply and safe injection sites, like all of those things wrapped up, the more we can do in that area, the more successes we're going to have than failures.
Couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
I regularly go back to the interview and the walk along that we did with the street cats. I'm no stranger to being exposed to people in throes of addiction. It has been a big part of my life for a very long time. And one of the things that I was most floored by was the relationships that the street cats built with their clients. And that's so fundamentally important. Like the fact that people talk about East Hastings in one breath and don't address the fact, why did East Hastings get turned into what it is? It was a failure of the mental health system. And anybody who refuses
It
to
was.
acknowledge,
Yeah, I got stories about that too.
oh,
Like,
I'm sure. And it was a predatory environment that the government dropped people into. It was, and that was, I mean, East Hastings is a perfect example of how government policy that's ideologically driven can cause huge problems and cause huge loss of life for a very long period of time. And I mean, as you were talking, I was making some notes here, and like, I go back to when the Lethbridge supervised consumption site was running. They were able to produce data that demonstrated that they took in more needles than they handed out. They had a net negative impact
yep.
on the number of needles that were on people's streets and on the sidewalks and on people's lawns and on and on and on
Well,
and on.
you know what else you see a lot less of? You see a lot less people shooting up in alleys.
Mm-hmm. And
You know,
it's a complex situation that has complex solutions. But the biggest frustration for me is like you hear people like Danielle Smith or Aaron Gunn or talking about what they want. And starting it from there misses the entire point because it can't be about what you want. It has to be about what these people need. And it's going to be different and it's going to be varied and it's going to be complicated. And to just say, you know what, there's this one measure that has all of this data that backs it up as saving lives and getting people into treatment and getting people into recovery because I don't like the idea. That is,
well,
words fail
the
me.
idea that you're enabling somebody, like the fact is that's the other myth that I hear perpetuate, even by reasonable people that they just don't know any better. That they've just never been in a situation where they've witnessed certain things. They've been sheltered, and so and some people can be open to it, but it you know, this myth that somehow by giving safe supply or decriminal that you're enabling addicts is so false.
Mm-hmm.
It nobody nobody wants to be an addict. It's like we used to say in Pace, little girls do not grow up thinking when I grow up I want to be a prostitute, right? And it's the same with addicts. Like children don't grow up and say, oh, one day I want to be an addict. It's something, when it happens for a varied amount of reasons, and nobody wants to stay in that because it's a horribly painful way to live, to have something that you're so dependent on that it takes away from so much of your life. And most people that are there, they're looking for a way out, and these kinds of initiatives are what give them that way out without them dying.
I mean, at the end of the day, one of the best metaphors that I've ever heard for safe supply is it's like if somebody's drowning and you throw them a life preserver. That life preserver isn't going to get them out of the water. It's not going to get them onto a boat. It's not going to get them to a place where they're not at risk of any of the things. But what it does do is it keeps them from drowning. It keeps them
No,
from dying.
absolutely, yeah.
And to just say,
No,
you know what? If they can't climb on the boat by themselves, they don't get a life preserver because we don't believe in life preservers here because Aaron Gunn says so is just,
well, it's like the analogy of giving somebody a hand up rather than a hand out.
mm,
You know,
yeah.
right? It's the same dichotomy. Like it's a way to give somebody a handout, not a handout, but a hand up, a way for them to be able to do something for themselves. Because without that life preserver, they're just perpetually treading water, and they're, you know, and going under and coming up and perpetually.
And some people are
And
throwing them
so,
rocks. But
what was that?
I said some people are just throwing them rocks.
Well, yeah, exactly. They're just throwing them rocks, and it's just so it lacks any kind of human compassion. You know, that people just I don't know. They want to make everything black and white. It's like they have some kind of, I don't know, borderline personality disorder where everything is in black and white and there's no gray and it's just not the way life works. And but anyway, I digress. And I it's just something that really it hurts me in my soul when I hear them perpetuating all these falsehoods, and I just have to say something.
I hear you.
That's
Thank
it.
you so much, Cassandra. I'm going to bring in. We got somebody who I don't believe has weighed in on the show before. I'm loving the profile picture. We're gonna talk about catnip, I guess, which is to some eyes a recreational substance. So I don't know if that's what we're going to talk about. But Lucy, welcome to the show. What's going on?
Great. Thanks for having me. I'm not going to talk about catnip, I promise you. Although I am the pusher for my cats.
There you go.
So just a bit about me. I'm infuriated. I really am. I used to work in addictions with the homeless in Calgary several years ago, and I've been clean and sober for 36 years.
Good on you.
Back when I was taking courses, I actually took a course through ADAC, who, if people don't know, that's the government run addictions agency. And I was introduced then to the Swiss model of harm reduction. At the time, it was fairly new still, even though they had been working on it for, I think, 10, 20 years. And so it was pretty novel in the world, though, at that time. And because I wasn't addicted to opiates, I was addicted to a lot of other substances. But I had to come to terms personally with the idea that it was okay to provide a safe supply, to not just have to quit cold turkey, right? Because I had quit cold turkey. So, and I was also working in a detox at the time. So I saw people suffering. And I also knew that when we did deal with clients, patients that were dealing with opiate addiction, that they needed medical intervention. And so, it only made sense to taper off if you could, because there's no way that you can talk to an addict who is in the throes of opiate addiction about, going to a 12-step program or going to a recovery house where they have to be clean and sober to even walk in the door. It just was not an option. They had to have medical supervision to make sure that they were okay when they were coming down, and then we could hopefully get them on the road to recovery. So I think you have to look at the undercurrents of this ideology that Danielle Smith has and people like her. And I think part of that is like opiate addiction, fentanyl overdoses, are increasingly are more affecting, the white middle class or the upper class, right? So it's gotten more attention because of that. But there's still the stigma that somehow addicts are criminals. So when you go down that road, the right wingers like to focus on the illegality of the drugs, where they're coming from, open borders, that whole shtick. And that's what gets them votes. They don't deal with the actual humanity of the people involved in the addictions. And it's much easier to focus on those types of issues that spread fear and, to denigrate addicts and the homeless as if they're, throwaway people in society rather than people who need mental health and medical treatment. When you allow opiate addictions to go untreated through harm reduction, it also affects our healthcare system, right? Because then you're going to have people ending up in emergency and in the hospital who need medical supervision in order to deal with what they're going through. We don't have a healthy healthcare system. It's already a mess. So you're piling on top of the situation already. And ideology is not a solution. Like, there are long-standing models and facts and evidence out there in the world. And, Danielle Smith may want to point to BC, and you pointed out that she's got that situation wrong, but there are models throughout the world that have shown the success of safe supply and harm reduction. So, like I said, it infuriates me. I'm a little bit upset, but I really want to appreciate the way that you explain the entire situation. I really want to say thank you to Cassandra, who also shared her experience. I think it's vital for people who might not understand exactly what's involved in dealing with addicts, what the realities are and why this is so incredibly dangerous. And I think the last thing I'll say is, yes, people are dying. And this is going to sound horrible, but there aren't enough people dying that their families and friends can form a lobby group to lobby some sense into this government. So, because they go where the money is, right? And dead addicts, they make news and their families and friends have to deal with the horrors of their grief. But it's easy for people like Danielle Smith and her party to ignore the suffering and make it an ideological rather than an evidence-based issue, because those people don't have power and influence. The homeless don't have power and influence, neither do addicts. So it's really important that if you are an advocate for the homeless, for addicts, alcoholics, that you keep raising your voice, that you keep pressuring the government, that you do everything you can to ensure that we try to get some evidence and science-based treatment going on in this province so that we can stop losing people. So I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Thank you so much for weighing in with that. And I totally agree with everything that you said there. One of the things that drives me nuts is when people like Danielle Smith, when they try to oversimplify incredibly complex situations. Like one of the examples that I have used in the past is, if somebody's bleeding, then they'll form a clot to stop bleeding. And that's a simple explanation, but anybody who has any background in medicine knows what a nightmare the coagulation cascade is and how incredibly complicated it is and how many points of failure there are. So just because you understand that somebody bleeds and they form a clot doesn't make you a hematologist, and you shouldn't pretend to be one or talk like you are one. There's nothing wrong. And this is one of the things that I wish more people embraced. There's nothing wrong with not knowing things. There's experts who spend their entire lifetime studying these things and learning about these things, and they bring real expertise. And that expertise, Aaron Gunn he was involved with the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, and now all of a sudden he's an expert on criminology and addiction. Like, it just makes my head absolutely explode. Not only that he's willing to take that position, but that someone like the Premier of Alberta is willing to give this guy the time of day because he'll name drop her. So anyways, that's my big rant about that. But we got Tammy, who is, I looks like for now, unless somebody else steps up, Tammy, you might be the last speaker of the night. What's going on?
Okay, well, I'm going to continue on with what you've been discussing about addicts and addiction. Not that I am. I did have, actually, one of my cousins ended up on the streets of Edmonton, and he died there on the streets of Edmonton.
I'm sorry, Tammy.
And my other cousin, Robbie, actually ended up being murdered in a drug. So I've had some tangential experience with it, but I'm gonna approach this from a slightly, I agree everything, like, don't take me coming from a different tangent as me saying Cassandra and Lucy are wrong. They're absolutely positively right. But one of the things you'll find in rural areas is they don't view the addicts as people. So I end up arguing this with people from the position of, even if you do not care about the addict, there is still something to be gained for folks, any people really, who've been involved in property crime, where you've had something expensive stolen from your vehicle, whether that be a catalytic converter or out in the farm. We end up with parts being stolen off of tractors and quads being stolen, and things that are they're being stolen for a lot of money. And in some ways, I don't, and we actually, I know you can't 100% say it's addicts, but in my case, I have an actual real life thing that happened. We had my mother's Frontier, a Nissan Frontier truck. After mom died, it was parked at the farm and it was promised to my daughter. But it needed some repairs, so it was just parked. A person that we know is an addict, we tracked them down, was in the process of stealing it. When they got caught, they ran from the truck. We actually, in the community, found out where he was, but the RCMP chased him. And we don't know. We never heard whether he was ever caught, even though we'd gotten a picture of the fellow that did it. He's a known addict. He lives in a drug house in Alberta Beach. And I mean, he was well known in the community. This had been going on for a long time. But they're stealing those things and selling them for pennies on the dollar.
Yep.
Just to get their drugs. So if you look at it from the position of you just want to stop the thieving, the stuff being stolen in the areas, if you're rural or if you're a city dweller, the best way of doing it is to give them their drugs that are safe and controlled, and that they're not having to go to an addict, a drug dealer to get it.
100%.
And then the folk that are out in the farm, we actually know where the guy that fences their crap to give them the money to go get their drugs. So I don't blame the addict. I blame the guy that's buying the stuff off of them.
Totally.
And giving them pennies on the dollar.
Totally. Yeah, I agree with you 100%, Tammy.
So if you could look at it even from the point of not helping the drug addict, look at from the point of, because one of the things, the fellow that we now have as our caretaker on the farm, he actually met up with one of the RCMP officers and was talking to them and says, well, if you could come around and check the place out occasionally. Well, we can't. We can't even go on your property unless you've called us in and there's a crime being done. We will not come onto your property. So he literally said to the cop, go away. You're no good to me. So all of these promises from Danielle Smith about her Alberta police force will be no different than the RCMP right now.
Totally agree.
Because
Same laws.
They still aren't allowed to go onto the property.
Yep.
They aren't allowed to go there. Yep. And I know it happens in Edmonton too, because they stole my mobility scooter.
Oh,
the one that I'd gotten from my mother that was her mobility scooter. They stole it. It just, It makes me irate.
It's so
And
frustrating, and especially like I said, when you take a look at what the costs are for when we're talking about opiates, when we're talking about fentanyl, we're talking about literally a couple of dollars a day for the folks that are going to commit those property crimes in order to keep themselves from getting dope sick and all of the other things. It's you compare that to, like, I don't know how much a catalytic converter costs. I bet it's not cheap. And
$2,000.
okay, so there you go. So,
$2,000.
Quick back of the napkin math, $2,000 gives you 100 days of not having to worry about these people stealing stuff. And I can't help but wonder how many catalytic converters get stolen every day. Like, I totally understand where you're coming from, and I share that argument. Like, even if you can't find it within yourself to.
And I do. I
no, I
find it
know
in
you
my
do.
heart to.
Yeah, no, I'm not saying you.
But it's just a different way to get people that can't to see it.
Totally agree. Anything else you want to add in there, Tammy? I got Ziad's tapped in.
No, let Ziad speak.
All right.
And you have a great day.
Thank you.
Great night. Thank
you so much. And thank you so much for sharing your stories as well, because boy, that's some hard stuff that you've had to navigate there. And I understand there's a lot of people who are like, that's private, I don't want to share it. But the more that we talk about these things, the more that other people are able to identify and find humanity in others. And that's the most important thing. So thank you so much for that.
No problem. You have a great night.
You as well. We'll bring in Mr. Ziad Faisal, who last week did not raise my blood pressure. So I have a feeling I've got 2 weeks worth of hypertension he's about to bring to the table. Ziad, what's going on, my friend?
How have I become toxic to you? I like you.
No, it's not that you're toxic. It's just you bring quantifiable truth, and that's challenging sometimes, I'll say. But it's not that I don't want to hear it. It's just that sometimes it's like, oh, for fuck's sakes.
Well, this time I'm not going to bring my own heat, but I am going to recommend a beautiful blog article written by two lawyers, Nigel Banks and Jennifer Caution, actually law professors at University of Calgary, about the Ethics Commissioner Tressler's sanctions against Premier Smith for the Arthur Pawlowski scandal. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, no, I'm hearing you great.
Okay, good. So to your tweet announcing this space, I provided a link to the AB Log post about their article. And their main point is that the Premier doesn't get to decide her own sanctions for breaking the Conflict of Interest Act. And so, as a bit of background, in January, our Premier had a conversation with Arthur Pawlowski, doing her best to prevent him from being tried for various charges related to Coots. And in May, the Ethics Commissioner Tressler reported on it, and the big surprise from that is that Smith had pressured the Attorney General Shandro, pressured him very hard, despite her knowledge in that call and in her admissions to the Ethics Commissioner later during the Ethics Commissioner's investigation, that she knew it was wrong to do so. She knew that when Justin Trudeau had done it with his Attorney General over the SNC Lavalin matter, he got in trouble and he was found to break the Federal Conflict of Interest Act. Unfortunately, the Federal Conflict of Interest Act is just a fact-finding act where the Ethics Commissioner, federal one, can say yes or no or find fact that there was a violation of the act, which Justin Trudeau was found to have done. But there was no sanction in the federal matter, the Justin Trudeau SNC Lavalin matter. In the Alberta one, there is a sanction. And because the Ethics Commissioner reported when the legislature was not sitting, the writ had dropped for our May 29th election, and her report was on May 17th. She chose to reserve her right to recommend sanctions. So the recommendation she made was, one, mandatory training for all MLAs to go back to grade 8 and do social studies again. And secondly, did that slip out? And then she made one, I don't really like this one, that maybe the act could be revised for a stay of investigations after a writ drops. And I don't really like this one. On one hand, I can see ethics complaints can be made as a political tactic, but on the other hand, the writ period in Alberta is so short. And I think we need this accountability where someone's doing something unethical. We want to catch them before the election, otherwise we end up with another Sean Chu situation.
One would think, yeah.
So one would think, yeah. So, you know, we have regulators and officers of the legislature who are there to protect us voters. And so I think they should be operating before an election more importantly than ever. So she reserved the right to recommend the sanctions when the Legislative Assembly was back in session. And what Professor Banks and Professor Caution have done, building on their previous work with Professor Olzinski as well, is they've shown how the Act specifies that the Ethics Commissioner's report must be tabled in the legislature within 15 days of the legislature sitting. And further, that the Assembly must debate and vote on that report within 15 days of it being tabled. Now, what our illustrious Premier Smith did is she gave an apology, and then her new Attorney General, Mickey Amory, said he considered the matter closed.
Yep.
So, looking at that apology, she minimized her knowledge that what she was doing was wrong. She knew that she was following the same footsteps as Justin Trudeau with his Attorney General and that she shouldn't be doing it. But in her apology, she just said, oh gosh, I didn't know. I was just talking to my lawyer. And when Mickey Amory considered the matter closed, he also defamed a member of the opposition,
Yes,
saying that they lied. But regardless of the noxious style of the apology and the declaring the matter closed, that's still the Premier deciding her own penalty, her own sanction. And she doesn't get to do that. The Ethics Commissioner still has to recommend the sanction. And the Speaker has to table it. And the Legislative Assembly as a whole has to vote on it, has to debate it and vote on it. One of the other things these law professors wrote about is they looked at some of the previous sanctions. One with Rick McIver, one with Singh. So McIver was a minor one with a $500 fine. And then there was another one, a more serious matter from 2002, a failure to disclose assets, liabilities, and income involving MLA Robert Fisher. But Fisher resigned his seat in anticipation of the commissioner's report. Mm-hmm. But that would have been a serious sanction. So what these professors have done, as law professors have a great habit of doing, is looking at precedents and going, so what kind of sanction would the commissioner be appropriate to recommend here? And they're looking at not an apology, but a reprimand or a suspension. And so, yeah, I just wanted to highlight this article. We heard Smith give her apology, and I really wanted to compliment the work of Professors Banks, Caution, and Olsinski, because they're doing what law professors are good at doing, which is, remember about the law? Yeah, we're kind of a law-abiding province, and our Conflict of Interest Act is kind of important to us, and we actually have to carry it out. We can't just have an ethics commissioner do a report, and then we let the person found in violation by the report decide their own sanction.
And I think it's so important to remember as well that when it comes to the scope that the ethics commissioner operates under, it is exceedingly limited. If it wasn't for the fact that Smith had said to Shandro that she wanted it to just she wanted it all to go away, and she was concerned about the optics and how it might affect her and her government if Archer decided to have a temper tantrum. That's the only thing that gave her a personal stake. If she hadn't had said that to Shandro, she wouldn't have been in violation of the Ethics Act, and it would all be a nothing burger. So to fall into the scope of the ethics commissioner is a really hard thing to do to begin with, and the egregious nature of the things, I think, really can't be understated.
Yeah, you're kind of threading the eye of the needle to fall in conflict with the Conflict of Interest
Yeah,
Act.
you have to screw up in a really big way, really, really specifically.
Yeah, yeah. But I think, there's she has a personal interest beyond that of just being ideologically aligned with Arthur Przlowski. And that is that, you covered this quite well in this town square that you provide for us Albertans. But you remember she raised over $100,000 in a GoFundMe purportedly to help Albertans get better access to vaccines and alternative therapeutic treatments for COVID. And then instead, without doing anything on those claimed objectives of her GoFundMe, gave, we believe, $60,000 to JCCF for lawsuits against the Alberta government.
Yep.
And aside from $3,000 to $5,000 in GoFundMe charges, the rest was held by the law firm of her executive director, chief of staff, Grand Poobah, Rod Anderson.
Yep.
And so she has a financial vested interest as well in seeing COVID convictions advanced by the Alberta government set aside. So it's something that I think our ethics commissioner is missing. And actually, I don't see an analysis by Professors Banks and Caution, and I want to talk to them about it, because I found it interesting that someone before being sworn in as premier is funding lawsuits against the very government they're asking to lead.
Yep.
And would be taking an oath as a premier of allegiance only to the crown, only to the government, while she's got $60,000 at JCCF suing the Alberta government.
I still just want to know, I just want to know if she got a tax receipt for it. I'm certain that she did. I would be absolutely shocked, flabbergasted, all of the things if she didn't get that sweet, sweet, sweet tax write-off. But that's one of the questions. That's actually the question, as we've pointed out before. That's the question that got us blocked by the Premier of Alberta. We said, hey, what's the deal with this? And she said, nuh-uh, we didn't.
And she could have just answered it. She could have said yes or no. And why wouldn't she? It'd be stupid not to. You've raised money. You've made a donation to purportedly a charitable organization. Why wouldn't you take the receipt? I mean, I'd expect her to. I don't really see anything incriminating in her getting a tax receipt for making a charitable donation. Where I see the conflict of interest is her becoming premier of a government while funding lawsuits against that government.
There is apparently I've seen some legal opinions on this.
Okay.
But there is apparently some precedent for if you fundraise money for a specific thing, and then you not only don't use that money for that thing, but find a way to personally gain from it, it turns into, there's like this tax law thing. Again, it's a lawyer thing.
Yeah.
But it does potentially get complicated for her quickly if she was to say, yes, I did take the tax receipt. But I would be willing to bet it's been routed through 16 different things. So
I looked at that, I thought it might be, I don't know if the legal term is wrongful conversion, but when you raise money for one purpose and you apply it to a different one.
Yeah.
And mainly, my understanding is it's the GoFundMe rules. And the thing is, she was providing updates along the way. And really, she's accountable to her donors. I don't know of any civil or criminal law that covers the conversion of funds from one purpose to another. It's kind of a donor beware thing with GoFundMe, that if you're going to donate to a certain person and they say their cause is for rescuing pink elephants and they actually shoot purple dolphins, that's between you and the individual fundraiser. So, I guess some of her donors, if they wanted, could sue her saying, well, you misrepresented it. But she's at least covered by the GoFundMe rules because she disclosed the change of use of the money.
Interesting. Well, I'm gonna throw it out to our audience. If there's any lawyers who are listening to this episode, and I know a couple of you do, please send a DM because would love to get some clarification on that. That wasn't that stressful for me, Ziad. You got anything else?
No, and I'll just remind folks, I'm not a lawyer. I just have learned some big words from being around lawyers, so it's kind of an occupational exposure kind of a thing.
There we go. Awesome. All right, thanks so much, Ziad. I really appreciate that that recap of the debacle.
Always a pleasure. And I'll go on mute, but I'll throw that the link to that article up in the Nest on Spaces if you don't mind.
Yeah, absolutely. Fill your boots, man.
Okay.
And I think we've already retweeted it, so there's that too. That clears out the queue of our speakers for the evening. So now I want to say this thanks, but before y'all go, we got one more thing we're gonna do. So don't just bail out because this is the part where I talk about the Patreon. Because there's something coming after this. I do want to say a big thank you to everybody who has been listening on the Twitter Spaces or watching on the YouTubes and the Facebooks tonight. Especially want to say a big thanks to all of our speakers. And as always, man, the chat was busy tonight. I'm scrolling for days here. This is awesome. I have so much reading material to do. I love it. Thank you so much, everybody, for being so engaged in the chat and sharing all of your thoughts in there. If you appreciate the kind of content that we're trying to produce here at The Breakdown, you can help us continue to produce it by signing up to be one of our Patreon sponsors at our Patreon site at www.patreon.com/thebreakdownab, where for just the price of fancy cup of coffee a month, you can help us continue to do all this stuff. We have multiple FOIPs pending with the government of Alberta, and we're able to do that because of the support that we get from our Patreon sponsors. So it gives you a warm, fuzzy feeling. And then you can tweet at Danielle Smith if you're not blocked, which probably are because it's like everybody. That's one of our FOIPs, by the way. You can tweet at Danielle Smith or your MLA of choice and be like, I support The Breakdown. No. And I hear that some of them find that wildly aggravating. So you get a warm, fuzzy feeling from that as well. But to wrap things up, we're gonna do things a little differently this week. We're gonna change it up a little bit. Today is July 2nd. Yesterday was July 1st, which is Canada Day. In case you were unaware, as you're listening to this, Canada Day has become, for me personally, an increasingly complex day of, I mean, it used to be a day of celebration for me. I would get the t-shirts and the hats and all the things and go watch the fireworks and all of that. And as I have continued to learn more and more about Canada's history and the impacts of all of those things, and it turns out that fireworks are really bad for all kinds of different animals and a lot of different things. Canada Day has become more and more complex for me. And it has been really difficult to find a way to put that into words. That being said, on Canada Day, I was sitting on my my porch, and my wife showed me a video, and it put all of the things into words. And I'm certain we're probably going to get flagged for some sort of copyright infringement on this video, and there will be a strike of some kind. But this is such an incredible composition, song written by Jordan Hart, who is a Canadian. From the limited bio information I was able to find as I was madly Googling him over the last 24 hours. He's also an Albertan, and he put together this piece. He put the first verse out a couple of years ago, and he released the full song. You can listen to it on all of the streaming platforms. And props to him. And I say this as a musician myself. Streaming revenue is kind of like, oh, that's cute. But if a song gets a big enough audience, it can actually raise a little bit of money. And he's donating all of the money from this song to support a variety of Indigenous and First Nations groups. So we're going to close the show out this week with that. Please don't sue us, Jordan. We really like your song.
215 and counting, children 6 feet underground. This isn't who we are, but this is where we're from somehow. Our history has pages missing, now it's been exposed. So bring your salt to school, kids, question everything you're told. Seems history is written by hands holding bigger guns. So be careful when you listen and more careful when you judge. It's 7:51 now and the dirt soaked up the blood, but the bones remain to tell us that there's work here to be done. Oh, Canada, my heart is dim, but I still see you rising in tall. Canada, my heart is dim, but I still see you rise. When you're later and 10,000 bodies surface from the dirt, mothers, daughters, sons and fathers heavily observe, standing on the land we call the glorious and free. Well, can we still sing that proudly with our unearthed history? I for one believe in what our nation can become, if we can stand together now and lead ourselves with love. As we watch one man's speak, causing this bloodshed in the east, and hear the cry of nations that have never come to peace. I say let's be a beacon of what freedom really means, to celebrate our differences and care for those in need, to look into the mirror and teach our own damn history, and never to forget the children buried underneath. As we sing, oh,